Mexico's war on drug cartels was a controversial idea from the beginning. An hour before then-President-elect Felipe Calderón was due to be sworn in, opposition lawmakers tried to block the doors of Mexico's congressional chamber. Members of the ruling party chanted, "We want peace." Calderón may have hit the ground running on a new path paved with good intentions, but it wasn't one of pacifism. He started with his home state of Michoacán, where drug violence had gotten out of hand, deploying federal security forces with the aim of taking down top cartel bosses.
Durante las actividades de interdicción y hostigamiento que llevarán a cabo en el Estado, respetar en todo momento los derechos humanos de la población civil.
But security forces in this new war would be accused of committing widespread abuses, including torture, killings, and disappearances. Calderón's so-called Kingpin strategy set off a cascade of violence across the region. Over the next 10 years, more than 150,000 people were killed and 28,000 disappeared. More than the number of civilians killed in the Iraq War over a similar period. One of the most intractable aspects of the conflict is the supply and demand dynamic between the US and Mexico for drugs and weapons.
There is one issue where Mexico needs your cooperation: stopping the flow of assault weapons and other deadly arms across the border.
When Calderón left office, national polling suggested that 2/3 of Mexicans believed that traffickers were winning the fight against organized crime. And in that same survey, more than half said they approved of Calderón's approach. It's why Mexico's war on drugs has lived on. Calderón's predecessor, current president Enrique Peña Nieto, has upheld it, despite the fact that when he was elected in 2012, he had pledged to take a different approach and reduce violence. Nieto's administration says its security strategy is working. But levels of violence continue to rise in many states across the country. Mass graves and disappearances still plague Mexico's collective consciousness, including 43 students who went missing in Guerrero State 2 years ago. Critics of the war on drugs say Mexico remains far from eradicating abuses and impunity associated with its security policy. And yet, the Mexican people still consider the military the best security force for fighting organized crime. It seems that despite the high body count, the war on drugs will continue to be fought, whatever the cost.
Well, Randolph Nogel joins me now. He's been following the story closely over the past few years. Randolph, so you have the United States, the Mexican government, taking out kingpins, getting bad guys. Have they really gotten to the root of the problem?
Well, the root of the problem is essentially supply and demand, and the lax gun laws in the U.S. are one of the key demands. Unfortunately, that's not going to change in the U.S. anytime soon, and particularly in these southern states that abut the Mexican border. These are some of the laxest gun laws in the entire country, which not only just handguns, but also the kinds of assault weapons that are turning up in Mexico.
A couple years ago, they nabbed that guy, El Chapo, right? And he'd escaped from prison, and they got him again, and so on. And you have these almost mythical characters created. They have a following, massive characters. And it's seen as a victory whenever they arrest these guys. But is there an argument that maybe the past decade, the policies of the past decade, created those sorts of characters in the first place?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in one sense, yes, because the crackdown in general has thrown a lot of revenue and funding behind this effort. And what you see in Mexico is endemic corruption. So the argument can be made that even by cracking down, you're sort of fueling the problem. At the same time, what you've seen is by going after some of these kingpins, by chopping the head off, so to speak, it's created turf wars in some instances and ratcheted up the violence. And I think that's really the thrust. Not necessarily that you've emboldened or further empowered kingpins, but really that the violence that ensues after you take down one of these kingpins, that's been the source of a lot of people's complaints. And you've seen it in the numbers, in the figures, 150,000 dead over the last 10 years since Felipe Calderón initiated this war on drug cartels.
No. Something interesting I found from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. So I went to their website and I was looking for their arguments for the sort of continuation of the drugs wars and continuing the current policy. And they have some amazing stats on crime. They have some amazing stats on terrorism, on the medical effects. But interestingly, from the supply chain right to the very end, a lot of their data and a lot of their stats are very sort of generic. They're not about Mexico in the United States. They're basically like, drug use leads to homicides, drugs are bad for you, terror organizations like to traffic in drugs and so on. So it's very generic. They don't really give many specific examples of how this specific policy has worked. Is that revealing?
I think it's revealing in the sense that, we talk about what Mexico is doing to fight its drug war. And in one sense, I think a lot of these politicians find themselves between a rock and a hard place. Because if they, for instance, if they wind down the war on drugs, then they're going to be seen by and large as sort of weak on the problem. You see the majority of Mexicans actually still support the war on drugs, despite the brutal effects, the militarization of police forces, human rights abuses.
Yeah, I mean, some of those cartels are like worse than Daesh, right? In the way they operate, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that in the report there, you saw that 150,000 people killed in Mexico over a 10-year period, while 125,000 people killed in Iraq. I mean, this story perhaps isn't reported as widely, but that's sort of another issue. But what I would say about this general dynamic is that it really depends a lot on the U.S. The U.S. has a huge stake in this, and the U.S. Is part and parcel of the problem in terms of their gun laws, in terms of the porous border. It will be interesting to see what happens in this next administration with all of the border security measures that are said to be forthcoming.
Okay, Randy, we're out of time to chat, but it's been good to chat. Thanks for that.